Hello, that's my Cambridge presentation. My ID is 0379. My presentation is about the unequal compensation of legal migrant workers. This will touch on the political and historical aspects of this ongoing dilemma. Now, my group. The group problem is migrant workers receiving inequitable compensation for their labor. They're exploited by giving cheap labor, making it hard for them to make a living. My lens is the political and historical lens, which in relation to this project is the history of inadequate wages and the government involvement. Cultural and social is presented by Gabriel Adams, the economic lens is presented by Evan Searby, and Anthony Sanchez is presenting the ethical lens. Now the specific problem. The problem is migrant workers receive low pay for the work they put out. Migrants internationally receive less pay doing the same job as others. Many countries have a lack of policies that will help with this gap in their states, whilst others do have policies but do not enforce them. The past few centuries, the wage inequalities have been prevalent, which could be a major factor in causing most of these gaps due to built-in prejudice. According to the International Labor Association, there is an unexplained component of the wage gap that could potentially be due to historical factors. The migrant wage problem is an international dilemma that can be seen all around the world. The problems that deal with the inadequate compensation for migrant workers are modern slavery, migrant workers versus local workers, and child exploitation. Modern slavery is a huge problem internationally. Many migrant workers are put into slavery to perform forced labor. According to the International Labor Association, $10,548 to $22,198 underpayment of forced labor are forced per person in different regions such as the Middle East, North Africa, transition economies, and some parts of Asia. There are more modern systems in place called the kafala system, which is used by the Middle Eastern governments. This system promises work to bring money for workers' families, but they aren't told where they're going, which is most commonly Jordan, Lebanon, and most of the Arab Gulf. The system is supported by the Middle Eastern governments because they have extremely harsh policies towards non-citizens. Wage competition is also high with migrant workers against local workers, which leads to a depression of migrant wages compared to the local worker counterparts. In some countries, migrants will make 13% less than national workers, but can be up to 42% in other countries. Migrant workers have to compete with local workers, but even with the same job, migrant workers receive less compensation for their labor. Children will migrate due to a number of reasons: economic, cultural and social, emergencies, or personal push factors, and face wage exploitation by forced labor and being manipulated because they're children. Migrating without their parents leaves them vulnerable to forced labor or lower wage jobs. Even with adults, they're still vulnerable due to harm due to unsafe working agencies and governments that treat them like they're illegal immigrants. The International Convention of Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families, 56 of 206 recognized states have passed this treaty. Although few states have other policies similar to this treaty, many others do not, which allows for employers and states to have their way with the migrant workers. This can cause wage disparities for migrant workers because they have no rights in the states they work in. The Gini coefficient is by definition a statistical measure of the inequality represented a set of values, which in this case the values are the unexplained migrant wage gap. The graph represents the Gini coefficient for the migrant workers in different countries. The closer to 45%, the more of a gap there is. So this shows that migrant workers have a major pay gap in some of these countries, although some countries do not have a gap with their migrant workers, which is shown as the negative means gap. This graph shows the modern slave count around the world. Note, not all of them are migrant workers, but a good majority are according to the International Labor Association. But what is this even supposed to mean? Modern slave has a loose definition for today because it comes in many forms. For this situation, it's someone who's withheld compensation and is promised or is given very little compensation and has no way to leave. On this graph, there's 16 million modern slave workers, which many migrant workers are a part of. They're withheld payments for their labor, and their situation forces them to keep working. The 4.8 million state imposed is by the kafala system or similar systems used around the world. The last 4.1 million people into sexual labor, which is many migrant workers being forced to lines of work for little no pay, with almost no way to leave. Now the local problem. H2A Workers is a government program to help local farm workers from being undermined from employers. Many migrant workers are a part of this program to help them, yet H2A workers are severely underpaid and cannot ask for more money. They will not be able to return to work because of how the program works. The program makes it to where employers pick who they want to come back to the country to work, because after the workers are done working, they return to their home country. Visa holders are affected by the H-2A because that's how they work in Florida. But with the use of the H-2A, they can become very restricted by employers with the effects of their payment. This is because employers have the right to withhold payments due to the program, so they're forced into a low-income exploitative situation. Many visa holders have to pay expensive traveling fees or pay bribes or jobs and visas. Policies of Florida are allowing underpayment of migrant workers. The agricultural policies such as the H-2A, the J-1, the A3/G5, according to the Polar's data analysis of 2018 to 2019, 72% of migrant workers victims were a part of these policies, many of which are victims of wage theft and low compensation. Do you know not all 72% are in Florida, but a majority has been shown here locally. Due to many migrant workers in Florida having H-2A and H-2B, these policies are made with the intent to help these workers, yet they're still being exploited, which goes to show that there are many flaws with this program. But policymakers choose to do nothing even with strong protests against it. Local governments choose to ignore the migrant workers. That disregard of the workers makes the government part of the problem. This graph represents the legal status of farm workers from 1991 to 2020. Shown on the graph is migrant workers making up a good percentage of farm workers. The H-2A workers are some of the lowest paid workers in the U.S. labor force. Some of the biggest H-2A workers are Georgia and Florida, having considerably low wages to the H-2A states. Migrant workers make up a good amount of the H-2A workforce, even outside Florida, but most of them work in Florida. I have the solution. The group solution is for the International Labor Association to create specific labor laws because each country is different from each other. Using a social influence, governments can be pressured by its people to enforce and create laws that help narrow the gaps between incomes. My individual solution is that to help solve these problems is to internationalize right treaties, specifically the Migrant Employment Convention that helps migrant workers that 56 countries have ratified. Making more bills like this will help popularize the ratification of similar treaties. This can lead to other solutions like sanctions. Sanctions will force countries into making decisions instead of facing economic hardships. It's a great idea to finally follow regulations and help migrant workers, but this can lead to restrained relations between countries, so there have to be specific sanctions so it doesn't destroy their economies but forces their decision. Looking in the past can also be very helpful, as it can show solutions to prevalent problems. Unknown factors to the wage gap could be found out by looking through history. Finding out these unknown factors, according to the International Labor Association, will create favorable situations for migrant workers. This is in my bibliographies. Thank you for listening to my presentation.